The Holmes dynasty was a hollow shell. Once the heirs to the massive Fleischmann yeast fortune, by the turn of the century, they were financially impotent. Aristocrats with a famous name, but empty bank accounts. Stained by the Enron scandal and terrified of irrelevance, the family faced a binary choice: fade into obscurity or con their way back to power. They chose the con. A fallen bloodline weaponized its last remaining asset, its reputation to defraud the Murdochs, the Waltons, and the DeVoses. They attempted to bankroll their return to glory by selling a medical lie, proving that for a dying dynasty, human blood is just another liquid asset. Was Elizabeth born a genius or created by greed? The greatest fraud in Silicon Valley history germinated long before the first microchip was soldered. It took root in the fading drawing rooms of a declining American dynasty. Elizabeth Holmes emerged from a lineage haunted by the memory of squandered wealth, a family suffocated by the expectation of greatness, but stripped of the capital to sustain it. To comprehend the scale of her deception, one must examine the Holmes curse, a multi-generational obsession with status that drove a young girl to view the world as a resource to be extracted. The Holmes bloodline was, by all accounts, American royalty. Elizabeth's ancestors included the founders of the Fleischmann's yeast empire, industrial titans who reshaped the American food landscape and lived in Gilded Age splendor. They owned islands, yachts, and the respect of a nation. Yet, by the time Elizabeth was born on February 3rd, 1984 in Washington, D.C., that golden era had dissolved. The vast fortune had been eroded by time, bad investments, and the profligacy of heirs who spent faster than they earned. Elizabeth grew up in a state of genteel poverty, a psychological pressure cooker, where the family maintained the external markers of the elite: private schools, exclusive clubs, the right connections, while privately battling the anxiety of a dwindling bank account. Her parents, Christian Holmes IV and Noel Holmes, lived in the shadow of this decline. They raised Elizabeth and her younger brother, Christian V, with a singular crushing mandate: the restoration of the family name was their duty. Success was not an option. It was a debt owed to their ancestors. Christian Holmes IV cast a particularly long shadow over his daughter's psyche. A tall, handsome patrician, he spent his career navigating the highest corridors of power, serving as a vice president at the World Bank and holding senior roles at the U.S. State Department and USAID. He presented himself as a humanitarian, traveling to war zones to manage relief efforts. However, in the late 1990s, Christian took a position that would serve as a grim prophecy for his daughter's future. He became a vice president at Enron. The Houston-based energy giant stood at the time as the darling of Wall Street, a corporation hailed for revolutionizing the energy sector through innovation and new paradigms. In truth, Enron was a hollow shell of accounting fraud, a black box of lies destined to collapse in 2001, wiping out billions of dollars and sending its executives to prison. Elizabeth Holmes spent her formative teenage years in Houston, watching her father operate within a corporate culture built on hype, intimidation, and the falsification of data. She witnessed Enron executives treated like rock stars right up until the moment the FBI raided their offices. She absorbed a dangerous lesson from this era. In American capitalism, reality is malleable, provided the story is compelling enough. This intense environment produced a child who was profoundly isolated. Elizabeth showed little interest in play or connection. She was consumed by achievement. At the age of 9, she penned a letter to her father that would later become a central artifact of the Theranos mythology. What I really want out of life is to discover something new, something that mankind didn't know was possible to do. It was a declaration of conquest. She aspired to be an inventor, a billionaire, a figure etched into history. Her parents fueled this intensity. The family moved frequently, from D.C. to Houston to China, creating a rootless existence that forced Elizabeth to rely entirely on her own internal drive. With few friends, she filled her time studying, running, and mastering Mandarin Chinese. The family's time in China proved pivotal, further isolating her from her American peers and reinforcing her sense of exceptionalism. While other teenagers navigated the social hierarchies of the mall, Elizabeth started a business selling C++ compilers to Chinese universities. By the time she entered St. John's School, a prestigious high school in Houston, the mask of Elizabeth Holmes was already calcifying. She was known for an intense, unblinking stare that unnerved her teachers and classmates. She operated on little sleep, driven by a terrifying fear of mediocrity. She was a straight A student, yet there was a hollowness to her brilliance. She seemed driven less by intellectual curiosity than by a desperate need to win. The family's financial anxiety remained a constant background hum. She knew her parents were leveraging their remaining resources to keep her on the path to the Ivy League. She was their investment, their lottery ticket back to the Fleischmann era. The tragedy of her early life lay in the absence of a moral compass. Her father functioned as a bureaucrat in a fraudulent company. Her mother was a social climber obsessed with connections. Neither taught her the value of failure or the primacy of truth. Instead, they instilled in her the belief that the Holmes name entitled her to rule. In 2001, the Enron scandal exploded. Christian Holmes IV lost his job and his retirement savings. The family once again stared into the abyss of financial ruin. For the 17-year-old Elizabeth, this was the final catalyst. Seeing her father broken by the system, she resolved to become the predator rather than the victim. She would build a company so powerful that no one could ever take it away. She applied to Stanford University, the incubator of Silicon Valley billionaires. Accepted as a President's Scholar, she arrived on campus in the fall of 2002 with a grant to do research. She had no intention of being a student looking to learn. She was a woman on a mission to find a vehicle, a technology that she could ride to the moon. Biology and medicine were secondary. Disruption was the goal. At Stanford, she identified the perfect mark for her first con. Channing Robertson, the Associate Dean of the School of Engineering. A chemical engineering superstar with a reputation for brilliance and a massive ego, Robertson became her target. She sat in his office, fixing him with her wide blue eyes, and pitched him a vision of herself. She spoke of changing the world and her impatience with traditional classes. Robertson was captivated. He saw in her a young Steve Jobs, a prodigy. He failed to see that he was being groomed. The intense young woman in his office had no background in microfluidics, no understanding of hematology, and no patience for the scientific method. He saw what he wanted to see, a genius. He became her first champion, the first old guard patriarch she would seduce into lending her his credibility. In the summer of 2003, following her freshman year, Elizabeth traveled to the Genome Institute of Singapore to work on the SARS outbreak. There, amidst the panic of a global pandemic, the idea for the magic box crystallized. She observed the slow, painful process of testing patients for the virus, the nasal swabs, the blood draws, the waiting, and saw an opportunity. She returned to Stanford with a piece of paper. It was a patent application for a medical device for analyte monitoring and drug delivery. It sketched a patch worn on the arm that would sample blood painlessly, diagnose the disease, and deliver the cure instantly. It was science fiction. It was physically impossible. It violated basic laws of thermodynamics and physiology. Elizabeth, however, was unconcerned with physics. She cared about the patent. She filed it. In a move that would seal her fate and the fate of thousands of patients, she dropped out of Stanford. Using her tuition money, she incorporated a company called Real-Time Cures, later renaming it Theranos, a fusion of therapy and diagnosis. She was 19 years old. She possessed no degree, no medical training, and a concept that defied reality. But she had the Holmes name, the Enron lessons, and the backing of a star professor. The fallen aristocrat was about to begin her climb back to the top, willing to build her ladder out of lies. The incorporation of Theranos in late 2003 marked the transition from a student's daydream to a financial reality. But the capital that fueled this transition did not come from skeptical venture capitalists vetting a business plan. It came from the deep incestuous networks of the Holmes family's social circle. Elizabeth did not need to prove her science worked. She only needed to leverage her pedigree. Her first target was Tim Draper, a legendary Silicon Valley investor and the father of her childhood friend Jesse Draper. The Holmes and Draper families were neighbors in the wealthy enclave of Atherton. Elizabeth didn't pitch Tim Draper in a boardroom. She pitched him over the kitchen table. She sold him on the vision of a world without needles, a device that could unlock the secrets of the body with a painless prick. Draper, captivated by the intensity of this 19-year-old who spoke with the conviction of a prophet, wrote a check for $1 million. This seed money was the catalyst. With the Draper name attached to her, Elizabeth was no longer a dropout. She was a hot prospect. She used this initial validation to raid the bank accounts of her family's other connections. She secured funds from Victor Palmieri, a crisis management expert and longtime friend of her father. She raised millions more from private investors who were charmed by the Steve Jobs narrative she was already constructing. By 2004, Elizabeth had moved her operations out of a student house and into a rented office space in Palo Alto. She began to hire employees, engineers, chemists, and designers, but almost immediately, the toxic culture that would define the company began to calcify. The central problem was physics. The patch idea she had patented was impossible. It required sensors that didn't exist and drug delivery mechanisms that defied fluid dynamics. When her newly hired engineers tried to explain this to her, Elizabeth did not listen. She retaliated. She viewed scientific skepticism as personal disloyalty. One of the first casualties was Shaunak Roy, her co-founder and a PhD student she had poached from Channing Robertson's lab. Roy quickly realized that Elizabeth had no interest in the slow, iterative process of scientific discovery. She wanted magic. When the patch failed, she pivoted to a new concept, a handheld device the size of a toaster that could run hundreds of blood tests on a single drop of blood. She called it the Theranos 1.0, but the Theranos 1.0 didn't work either. The microfluidics were a nightmare. Blood coagulated. The sample size was too small to get accurate readings. The chemistry was erratic. Instead of pausing to fix the science, Elizabeth fixed the optics. She began to enforce a regime of extreme secrecy and compartmentalization. She forbade employees from talking to each other about their work. She hired security guards to patrol the office. She demanded total cult-like devotion. She was not building a laboratory. She was building a fortress to protect a lie that was still in its infancy. It was during this formative period that the fallen aristocrat persona fully took over. Elizabeth began to affect the mannerisms that would become her trademark. She adopted the black turtleneck, consciously modeling herself after Steve Jobs. She allegedly began to artificially lower her voice to a deep baritone, projecting an authority she did not possess. She slept 4 hours a night. She didn't date. She didn't take vacations. She was performing the role of the suffering genius, the visionary who sacrifices everything for humanity. Her parents, Christian and Noel Holmes, enabled this delusion. They did not caution her. They cheered her on. They saw in Theranos the vehicle that would finally restore the family's lost glory. Christian Holmes used his government connections to introduce Elizabeth to powerful figures, lending her the credibility of the Washington establishment. By the end of 2004, Elizabeth Holmes had raised over $6 million. She had a team of engineers working around the clock on a machine that was essentially a prop. She had a board of directors that was beginning to fill with older, powerful men who were charmed by her youth and her pedigree. The Holmes curse, the obsession with status over substance, had successfully birthed a corporate monster. The real-time cures were fake, but the money was real. The stage was set for the next phase of the con, the seduction of the old guard. Elizabeth realized that she didn't need to fool the scientists if she could fool the statesmen. She was about to turn her charm on the most powerful men in the American military-industrial complex, using their reputations as a shield to protect her fraud, using a famous name to hide a massive lie. In a normal startup, this would be the moment of collapse. But Theranos was not a normal startup. It was a cult of personality in search of an enforcer. Elizabeth needed someone who could impose order through fear, someone who could silence the dissenting engineers and construct a wall of secrecy so high that the outside world would never see the chaos inside. She found that person in Ramesh Sunny Balwani. Balwani was 39 years old, nearly 20 years Elizabeth's senior. He was a Pakistani-born software engineer who had made a fortune $40 million during the dot-com boom by selling his company just before the crash. He was wealthy, flashy, and aggressive, a man who drove a black Lamborghini with license plates that read, Veni Vidi Vici. He was also Elizabeth's secret lover. They had met in Beijing in 2002 when Elizabeth was just 18. By 2004, they were living together in a luxury apartment in Palo Alto. But to the employees of Theranos and the board of directors, Sunny was a ghost. Elizabeth kept their relationship entirely secret. When Sunny joined the company officially in 2009 as president and chief operating officer, he was introduced not as a boyfriend, but as a brilliant business mentor. Sunny's arrival marked the beginning of the culture of fear. He was a tyrant. He knew nothing about chemistry or hematology, but he knew how to bully. He prowled the hallways of the Palo Alto headquarters, monitoring the employees' comings and goings. He installed software to track keystrokes. He fired people for minor infractions, for being late, for asking questions, for not showing enough devotion. Under Sunny's regime, Theranos became a North Korean-style dictatorship. The engineering teams were siloed. The chemists were not allowed to talk to the software developers. This compartmentalization was sold as security to protect trade secrets, but its real purpose was to prevent anyone from putting the pieces together. No single employee knew that the whole machine was broken. Only Elizabeth and Sunny knew. They developed a relationship that psychiatrists would later describe as folie à deux, a shared psychosis. They reinforced each other's delusions. When the prototype machines failed during demos, they didn't fix the machines. They faked the demos. They pre-recorded results. They hacked the software to display success even when the hardware had failed. They built a reality distortion field that was impermeable to logic, but to keep the money flowing, they needed more than just fear. They needed credibility. Elizabeth knew that Silicon Valley investors were starting to ask questions, so she decided to leapfrog them. She aimed higher. She aimed for the old guard, the titans of American statecraft, who were too old, too rich, and too removed from technology to understand that they were being conned. Her primary target was George Shultz. Shultz was a living legend. He was the former Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, a man who had helped end the Cold War. In 2011, he was 91 years old, a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Elizabeth Holmes engineered an introduction. She didn't pitch him on microfluidics. She pitched him on patriotism. She told him that Theranos technology would save the lives of American soldiers on the battlefield. She spoke of healthcare as a human right. With her deep voice and her unblinking stare, she activated Schultz's protective grandfatherly instincts. He was captivated. He invited her to join the board. Crucially, Schultz didn't just trust her science. He trusted her bloodline. To him, she wasn't a reckless startup founder. She was a Holmes, a scion of the establishment, and one of their own. He saw the pedigree, not the fraud. George Shultz became the patient zero of the boardroom infection. Once Elizabeth had Schultz, she used him as a lure to catch the rest of the establishment. Schultz brought in Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. He brought in William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. He brought in Sam Nunn, former Senator, and James Mattis, future Secretary of Defense. By 2013, the board of directors of Theranos was arguably the most distinguished group of men ever assembled in a corporate setting. It looked like a shadow cabinet of the United States government. But there was one glaring omission. None of them knew anything about medicine. There were no biologists, no chemists, no diagnostic experts on the board. It was a board of statesmen, not scientists. And that was exactly how Elizabeth wanted it. These men were not there to provide oversight. They were there to provide cover. When skeptical investors or journalists asked questions, Elizabeth could simply point to her board. Do you think Henry Kissinger would be involved if this wasn't real? Was the unspoken, invincible defense. The seduction was total. Elizabeth granted these men shares worth millions of dollars on paper. She charmed them at dinner parties. She listened to their war stories. In return, they treated her like the granddaughter they never had. They protected her. When military regulators tried to inspect the Theranos labs in 2012 to see if the devices were safe for soldiers, General Mattis personally intervened to stop them. The old guard had become the unwitting bodyguards of a massive medical fraud. They lent their unimpeachable reputations to a 29-year-old dropout who was running a science experiment that didn't work. They didn't know that in the laboratories below their meeting room, the machines were failing, the data was being forged, and the scientists were being terrorized. One of those scientists was Ian Gibbons, and he was about to become the first casualty of the Dynasties' ambition. While Elizabeth Holmes was charming Henry Kissinger in the boardroom, the laboratories of Theranos were descending into a state of scientific anarchy. The Edison machine, the toaster-sized device that was supposed to run hundreds of tests on a single drop of blood, was a failure. The laws of physics were stubborn. When you prick a finger, the cells rupture, hemolysis, contaminating the sample. When you try to run multiple tests on a micro volume of blood, there simply isn't enough liquid to get an accurate reading. The results were erratic. The error rates were sky high and the machines constantly broke down. But inside the company, failure was not an option. Ian Gibbons, the chief scientist of Theranos, knew this better than anyone. Gibbons was a brilliant British biochemist, a Cambridge-educated expert who had spent decades in the diagnostic industry. He was the first experienced scientist Elizabeth had hired back in 2005. For years, he had tried to make the technology work. He was loyal, diligent, and deeply principled. But by 2011, he was a man in despair. He realized that Elizabeth and Sonny were lying. They were telling investors and the board that the technology was ready for commercial rollout, while Gibbons knew it couldn't even pass a basic validation study. He tried to warn Elizabeth. He told her the chemistry wasn't working. Her response was to marginalize him. She stopped inviting him to meetings. She created a parallel structure where younger, inexperienced sycophants reported directly to her, bypassing the chief scientist. The pressure on Gibbons intensified in 2012. Theranos had become involved in a patent lawsuit with a man named Richard Fuiss, a former neighbor and nemesis of the Holmes family. As part of the lawsuit, Fuiss's lawyers subpoenaed Ian Gibbons. They wanted to depose him. They wanted to ask him under oath if the Theranos technology actually worked. This was the Dynasties' nightmare. If Gibbons told the truth in a deposition, the fraud would be exposed. The $9 billion valuation would evaporate. Elizabeth and Sonny knew they had to stop him. They launched a campaign of intimidation against their own chief scientist. They pressured him to avoid the deposition. They implied that his job and his health insurance depended on his silence. Gibbons was trapped. He was 67 years old. He had a history of health problems. He needed the insurance, but he was a man of science. He could not lie under oath. The psychological torture broke him. In May 2013, days before his scheduled deposition, Ian Gibbons sat in his home, terrified. He told his wife, Rochelle, that he couldn't go on. "Elizabeth wants me to lie," he said. On the evening of May 16, 2013, Ian Gibbons took a massive overdose of acetaminophen. He was rushed to the hospital, but his liver failed. He died a week later, on May 23rd. When Rochelle Gibbons called Elizabeth Holmes to tell her that Ian, her first scientist, the man who had given 10 years of his life to her dream, was dead, Elizabeth did not offer condolences. She did not ask about the funeral. She did not send flowers. Her response was cold, transactional, and sociopathic. She simply said, "I want you to return the company laptop and the confidential documents immediately." For the employees inside Theranos, the death of Ian Gibbons was a message. It was the mafia moment. It proved that the company would devour anyone who stood in the way of the narrative. The culture of fear that Sonny Balwani had instilled was now absolute. If the chief scientist could be driven to suicide and then erased, no one was safe. With the problem of Ian Gibbons removed, Elizabeth was free to execute her grandest deception yet. She needed a commercial partner, a major retailer that would put her machines in stores across America and validate her technology to the world. She targeted Walgreens. The executives at Walgreens were desperate. They were terrified that Theranos would sign a deal with CVS instead. Elizabeth played on this fear of missing out, FOMO. She met with Dr. J. Rosan and the Walgreens leadership. She dazzled them. She promised them a wellness center in every store, a revolution that would bring millions of customers through their doors. When Walgreens' own consultants asked to see the lab data to validate the technology before signing the contract, Elizabeth refused. She played the trade secret card. She told them that she couldn't show them the inside of the Edison machine because they might steal her genius. She told them, "Trust me." And because she had Henry Kissinger on her board, and because they were afraid of CVS, Walgreens trusted her. In September 2013, ignoring the red flags and the lack of data, Walgreens announced a massive partnership with Theranos. They would roll out testing centers in their stores in Arizona and eventually nationwide. This was the point of no return. Until this moment, Theranos had been defrauding rich investors. Now they were about to start defrauding sick patients. They were going to take blood from real people, people with cancer, people with diabetes, pregnant women. and run it on machines that they knew didn't work. The laboratory of horrors was open for business. As the autumn of 2013 arrived, Elizabeth Holmes stood on the precipice of her greatest triumph. The partnership with Walgreens was signed. The board of directors, featuring Kissinger, Schultz, and Mattis, was locked in. The old guard had been successfully seduced. Now, it was time to seduce the world. In September 2013, Theranos officially launched its wellness centers in Palo Alto and Phoenix, Arizona. This was the public debut of the technology. Elizabeth appeared in the Wall Street Journal, hailed as the next Steve Jobs. She wore her black turtleneck on the covers of Fortune and Forbes. She told the story of her fear of needles, her desire to democratize healthcare, and her magical Edison device that could run 200 tests on a single drop of blood. The valuation of her company soared to $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes, at 29, was the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. However, the reality behind the scenes was criminal. Since the proprietary Edison devices were prone to failure, the lab relied on the secret cheating scheme established earlier, running diluted samples on hacked commercial Siemens analyzers. This reckless protocol meant that the data sent to doctors was not merely inaccurate, it was dangerously flawed. But the company proceeded anyway. They hid the Siemens machines in a separate, secure room in the lab, often referred to as Normandy. When VIPs like Joe Biden or Henry Kissinger visited the headquarters, they were shown the sleek Edisons humming in the front room, often running fake demo loops, while the real work was being done on the hacked commercial machines in the back. This was the laboratory of horrors. It wasn't just a failed startup, it was a Potemkin village built on biohazard. The employees were forced to sign draconian non-disclosure agreements. They were watched by security guards, and they were complicit in sending out medical data that they knew was potentially fatal. One of the young employees watching this unfold with growing horror was Tyler Schultz. Tyler was the grandson of George Shultz, the former Secretary of State and board member who was Elizabeth's biggest champion. Tyler had joined the company fresh out of Stanford, believing in the vision. But once inside the lab, he saw the reality. He saw the failed quality control checks. He saw the data being massaged. He saw the Siemens hack. In late 2013, Tyler tried to raise the alarm. He went to Elizabeth. She dismissed him with a cold smile. He went to Sonny Balwani. Sonny screamed at him, telling him he was arrogant and ignorant. Finally, Tyler went to his grandfather. He sat in George Schultz's living room and told him, "The machine doesn't work. The company is lying to you. You are being scammed." It was a pivotal moment. A grandfather had to choose between his flesh and blood and the charismatic young woman who had charmed him. George Schultz looked at his grandson and said, "Tyler, you're wrong. Elizabeth has assured me everything is fine." The seduction was so complete that George Schultz chose the fraudster over his own family. He told Tyler to shut up. Tyler quit the company, heartbroken and terrified, knowing that he was now a target of the woman who controlled his grandfather. As 2014 arrived, the trap was set. The Walgreens centers were open. Real patients, cancer survivors, diabetics, pregnant women were walking in, getting their fingers pricked, and trusting that the results they received were accurate. They didn't know that their blood was being diluted, hacked, and run on machines that the company had modified in secret. They didn't know that the revolution was a lie. The dynasty of deception had moved from the boardroom to the clinic, and the blood prophecy was about to claim its first civilian victims. As 2013 drew to a close, the Theranos wellness centers inside Walgreens stores in Arizona were bustling. The branding was impeccable, clean lines, soothing music, and brochures promising a painless future. But for the patients walking through the doors, The reality was a chaotic gamble with their health. The Edison machines were so unreliable that they were often kept offline. Instead, the vast majority of blood samples were shipped daily from Phoenix to the secret lab in Newark, California, where they were run on the hacked Siemens analyzers. The logistical nightmare was immense. Blood degrades over time. Shipping tiny, diluted samples across state lines meant that by the time they reached the lab, the chemistry was often compromised. The error rates spiked. Potassium levels came back impossibly high, suggesting patients were dead when they were actually walking around. Thyroid levels were erratic. But under the culture of fear enforced by Sunny Balwani, lab technicians were pressured to delete outlier data points until the results looked normal. They were fabricating medical history. While the lab was burning, Elizabeth Holmes was busy securing the final pillar of her legitimacy, the military. She had already seduced General James Mattis onto her board. Now she wanted a Pentagon contract. She pitched the idea of putting Theranos devices on medevac helicopters in Afghanistan. The narrative was compelling. Save soldiers' lives with instant blood tests in the field. However, a diligent official within the Department of Defense, Lieutenant Colonel David Shoemaker, raised a red flag. He asked for the FDA approval letters for the device. Elizabeth didn't have them because she had never applied for them. She claimed her device was a laboratory-developed test, LDT, and thus exempt from FDA oversight. Shoemaker was skeptical. He contacted the FDA. This triggered a surprise inspection. In late 2013, FDA investigators arrived at Theranos. Elizabeth and Sunny panicked. They hid the Edison lab. They showed the inspectors only the standard commercial machines. They managed to bluff their way through, but it was a close call. It reinforced their paranoia. They doubled down on secrecy, threatening anyone who asked questions with legal annihilation. The seduction phase was complete. The old guard had been tricked, their reputations leveraged to build a house of cards. But while Elizabeth had successfully charmed the boardroom, she forgot that her ultimate product was not a speech, but a medical device. And in the clinics of Arizona, where real patients were bleeding, the charm was about to wear off. When corporate fraud becomes deadly. By early 2014, the Laboratory of Horrors was operating at full capacity. Thousands of results were being transmitted every week to doctors and patients in Arizona. These were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They were life-altering diagnoses. They were telling women they were pregnant when they weren't. They were telling diabetics their blood sugar was fine when it was critically high. The vampire of Silicon Valley had successfully built her castle. It was guarded by lawyers, funded by billionaires, and run by terror. But the walls of the castle were made of paper, and the wind was beginning to pick up. The real victims, the patients on the receiving end of those falsified PDF reports, were about to start asking questions that no amount of intimidation could answer. The tragedy was moving from the realm of corporate fraud to the realm of physical harm, and the first casualties were already walking through the doors of Walgreens, rolling up their sleeves and trusting the girl in the black turtleneck with their lives. As the months of 2014 wore on, the technological deception inside the Theranos lab began to manifest as a human tragedy in the clinics of Arizona. The black box of the Edison machine, combined with the reckless dilution protocols on the Siemens analyzers, was producing data that was not just inaccurate, it was erratic and terrifying. The victims of this fraud were not sophisticated investors like Rupert Murdoch. They were ordinary people seeking answers about their health, who instead received a sentence of psychological torture. One of the most harrowing cases involved a woman named Sherry Ackley. a breast cancer survivor, Ackley relied on regular blood tests to monitor for recurrence. She went to a Walgreens wellness center for a routine check. The Theranos test came back with a result that stopped her heart. Her tumor markers were skyrocketing. The report indicated that her cancer had returned aggressively. Ackley was devastated. She began to prepare for the end of her life. She made arrangements for her family. She lived for weeks in a state of absolute crushing despair, believing she was dying. When her oncologist finally ordered a retest from a legitimate lab, Quest Diagnostics, the results were normal. Her cancer was still in remission. Theranos had simply generated a false positive, a random number churned out by a broken machine. But the trauma of believing she was dying was real, a spiritual death inflicted by a company that viewed her fear as a data point. Another victim was a woman named Erin Tompkins. She took a Theranos test that indicated her potassium levels were critically high, a condition that could lead to immediate cardiac arrest. Her doctor, alarmed by the report, sent her straight to the emergency room. Tompkins spent hours in the ER, undergoing expensive and invasive tests, terrified that her heart was about to stop. The hospital's own lab work showed her potassium was perfectly normal. The Theranos result was a phantom, a glitch caused by the hemolysis of the red blood cells in the tiny sample tube. Perhaps the most cruel errors involved pregnant women. Several women in Arizona received Theranos test results indicating that their HCG levels, the pregnancy hormone, were plummeting, a sign of an impending or active miscarriage. These women spent days grieving the loss of their unborn children, only to find out later, through tests from other labs, that their pregnancies were perfectly healthy. Elizabeth Holmes had sold them a painless test, but she had delivered the most profound pain a mother can experience, the false grief of a lost child. The doctors in Phoenix began to notice the pattern. They saw patients rushing to the ER for conditions they didn't have. They saw cholesterol results that fluctuated wildly from day to day. They began to tell their patients, don't go to Walgreens, don't use Theranos. But inside the company, the feedback loop was broken. When doctors or patients called to complain, they were met with stonewalling. Customer service representatives were trained to deflect, to claim that venous draws vary from capillary draws, or simply to hang up. There was no mechanism for correction because acknowledging the errors would mean acknowledging that the technology was a fraud. While the patients suffered, the internal resistance began to harden. Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz, had quit the company, but he could not quit his conscience. He was haunted by what he had seen. He knew that the validation reports sent to pharmaceutical companies were forged. He knew the QC failures were being hidden. In March 2014, Tyler took a step that would alienate him from his famous family and put him in the crosshairs of the most expensive lawyers in America. He filed a confidential complaint with the New York State Department of Health detailing the manipulation of the proficiency testing data. He then emailed Elizabeth Holmes directly. In a long, thoughtful message, he outlined the scientific flaws he had witnessed. He laid out the math. He begged her to fix it. Elizabeth did not reply. Instead, she forwarded the email to Sunny Balwani with a 3-word comment that dripped with disdain. Arrogant little kid. Sunny's response to Tyler was a masterclass in gaslighting. He wrote a blistering email calling Tyler ignorant and reckless, telling him that the only reason he still had a job before he quit was because of his grandfather. Tyler's departure triggered a legal assault. Elizabeth unleashed David Boies, the legendary litigator who had represented Al Gore in the 2000 election recount. Boies and his firm began to stalk Tyler. They pressured George Schultz to silence his grandson. They threatened Tyler with lawsuits that would bankrupt his entire family. They demanded he name his sources. Tyler Schultz stood alone. His grandfather, the man he idolized, sided with Elizabeth. George Schultz invited Tyler to his house, only to ambush him with two Theranos lawyers who tried to force him to sign a confession. Tyler refused. He was cut off, isolated, and terrified, but he did not retract his story. Simultaneously, another young whistleblower was finding her voice. Erica Chung, the lab associate who had been screamed at by Sonny, had also quit. She too filed a complaint with federal regulators at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS. Her letter was detailed, technical, and damning. It provided the roadmap for the inspectors who would eventually raid the lab. The vampire of Silicon Valley had successfully built her castle, guarded by lawyers and funded by billionaires. But the walls were made of paper. And while Elizabeth Holmes played the part of the untouchable aristocrat, a veteran reporter 3,000 miles away was about to strike the match that would burn it all down. The first 6 months of 2015 were a silent, high-stakes game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows of Silicon Valley. While Elizabeth Holmes was accepting accolades, she was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people and appointed a presidential ambassador for global entrepreneurship by the Obama White House. A mortal threat was moving through her network. John Carreyrou, the investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal, was methodically interviewing the victims of her fraud. He spoke to the doctors who were baffled by the errant results. He spoke to the nurses who had been forced to lie to patients. And he spoke to the whistleblowers, Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, who provided the forensic roadmap to the Normandy lab. When Elizabeth and Sonny Balwani realized that the journal was preparing an expose, they did not respond with data. They responded with a declaration of war. They activated the legal Death Star, the law firm of Boyes, Schiller, Flexner, led by the formidable David Boyes, who was also a Theranos board member, a conflict of interest that was practically incestuous, launched a scorched earth campaign to kill the story. The company unleashed a scorched earth legal campaign. They targeted whistleblowers like Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung with terrifying lawsuits, surveillance, and intimidation tactics, attempting to bankrupt them into silence before their stories could reach the public. As the publication date approached in October 2015, Elizabeth Holmes played her final card. She went to the owner of the Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch was not just a media mogul. He was the single largest investor in Theranos. In 2015, he had quietly invested $125 million of his personal fortune into the company. Elizabeth believed that she had bought his protection. She went to his office, charming and deferential, and essentially asked him to kill the story. She argued that the reporting was inaccurate and would damage a great American company. Murdoch faced a choice: protect his $125 million investment or protect the integrity of his newspaper. In a decision that stunned Elizabeth, who believed that all powerful men could be manipulated, Murdoch refused to intervene. He told her that he trusted his editors. He chose the truth over his money. On October 15, 2015, the bomb detonated. The Wall Street Journal published Carreyrou's front-page article, "A Prized Startup's Struggles." The headline was understated, but the content was lethal. The article revealed that Theranos was not using its own technology for the vast majority of its tests. It revealed the dilution of blood. It revealed the failed proficiency testing. It revealed that the emperor was not only naked, but was actively endangering the public health. The reaction in Silicon Valley was shock. The reaction in the Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto was a bunker mentality. Elizabeth Holmes did not hide. She went on the offensive. Later that same day, she appeared on CNBC's Mad Money with Jim Cramer. Her performance was a study in sociopathic dissociation. Wearing her black turtleneck, her eyes wide and unblinking, she looked into the camera and delivered a line that she had clearly rehearsed in the mirror. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she said, her voice dropping to its lowest baritone. "First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." She positioned herself as the victim of innovation, a martyr being persecuted by the establishment because she was too visionary. She denied everything. She lied about the Siemens machines. She lied about the accuracy of the tests. She lied to the millions of people watching, many of whom were patients. For a few weeks, the reality distortion field held. The board of directors, Kissinger, Mattis, Perry, issued a statement of full support for Elizabeth. They circled the wagons. They believed her over the journalists, but the article had done something that the lawyers couldn't stop. It had alerted the regulators. The FDA and the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, read the report and realized they had been asleep at the wheel. They couldn't ignore a public accusation that a lab was faking cancer results. In late 2015, the inspectors arrived at the Newark lab, but this time they didn't announce their visit. They walked past the reception desk, past the fake Edison showroom, and demanded to see the back room. They demanded to see Normandy. Sunny Balwani tried to block them. He tried to bully the federal agents, but they had badges, and he didn't. They entered the lab. What they found was a scene of biohazardous chaos. They found temperature logs that showed reagents being stored improperly. They found the hacked Siemens machines. They found quality control data that was a sea of red flags. They found that the lab personnel were unqualified and overworked. The CMS inspectors wrote a report that was a death warrant for the company. They declared that the Theranos lab posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. This is the most severe finding a regulator can make. It means that the lab is so dangerous it might kill someone today. As 2015 ended, the compromised lab was officially a crime scene. The Walgreens deal was collapsing. The retailer, realizing they had been conned and were now liable for patient lawsuits, scrambled to shut down the wellness centers. The old guard board members were beginning to ask their lawyers if they were personally liable. But Elizabeth Holmes was still in denial. She was still fundraising. She was still telling employees that the journal was a tabloid and the regulators were confused. She was preparing to host a holiday party while her company was being dismantled by the federal government. She had built a machine that ran on blood and lies, and now that the fuel was running out, she was determined to keep the wheels turning, even if it meant grinding up the people who had trusted her. By the end of 2015, the Newark facility had not just failed. It had imploded under the weight of federal scrutiny, investigative journalism, and its own structural incoherence. The CMS inspection report, released in early 2016 but detailing the conditions of late 2015, was a forensic autopsy of a disaster. It documented that the company's proprietary Edison machines failed quality control checks 87% of the time. It revealed that the lab had run nearly 900,000 tests on patients using equipment that was uncalibrated, unvalidated, and fundamentally broken. For the patients who had trusted the glowing blue Theranos logo, the fallout was immediate and terrifying. The company was forced to void 2 years' worth of blood test results. Tens of thousands of people received letters informing them that the medical data they had used to make life or death decisions, to change medication, to schedule surgery, to terminate pregnancies was worthless. This was the mass casualty event of the fraud. It wasn't a bomb or a virus. It was a data breach of the human body. The most significant corporate casualty was Walgreens, the pharmacy giant, which had invested $140 million and staked its reputation on the partnership, was humiliated. In June 2016, Walgreens formally terminated its relationship with Theranos and shut down all 40 wellness centers. They sued the company for breach of contract, alleging that Elizabeth Holmes had lied to them about the technology's readiness. But the most dangerous legal threat came from the investors, the hedge funds and family offices that had poured nearly $1 billion into the company, including the DeVos family, the Walton family, Walmart, and Rupert Murdoch, realized they had been swindled. They began to file lawsuits alleging securities fraud. Elizabeth Holmes, however, remained defiant. In a town hall meeting with employees after the Walgreens termination, she stood on stage, not apologetic, but messianic. She told her staff that they were under attack by the old guard of the medical establishment who feared disruption. She promised that the company would pivot, rebuild, and emerge stronger. She was still selling the dream, even as the repo men were coming for the furniture. But the pivot was a fantasy. The CMS imposed a 2-year ban on Elizabeth Holmes owning or operating a blood lab. The FDA revoked the approval for the one test, herpes, that Theranos had actually managed to clear. The company was legally paralyzed. As the walls closed in, the relationship between Elizabeth and Sunny Balwani began to fracture. The folie à deux that had sustained the fraud for a decade disintegrated under the pressure of subpoenas. In May 2016, Elizabeth fired Sunny. She banished him from the company, attempting to scapegoat him for the operational failures. It was a ruthless act of self-preservation. She tried to reframe the narrative. She was the visionary founder who had been misled by a bullying, incompetent COO. But the Department of Justice wasn't buying the innocent visionary act. The FBI had been quietly building a criminal case since the Wall Street Journal article appeared. They were interviewing the whistleblowers, collecting the voided test results, and following the money. The year 2015 ended with Theranos on life support. The valuation had crashed from $9 billion to zero. The Edison was revealed to be a box of wires and glue, and the vampire of Silicon Valley was about to face the only thing she couldn't charm, bully, or lie her way out of: a federal grand jury. The laboratory was closed. The trial was about to begin. From billionaire to defendant. The publication of John Carreyrou's expose in the Wall Street Journal on October 15, 2015, was not just a news event. It was a declaration of war against a reality distortion field that had held Silicon Valley captive for a decade. For Elizabeth Holmes, the article represented an existential threat, a breach in the hull of her billion-dollar ship. But her reaction was not one of panic. It was one of calculated, aggressive counterinsurgency. She viewed the truth not as a fact, but as an enemy combatant to be neutralized. In the immediate aftermath of the article, the atmosphere inside the Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto shifted from a startup culture to a wartime footing. Elizabeth and Sunny Balwani rallied the troops. They held all-hands meetings where they denounced Carreyrou as a tabloid writer who hated innovation. They painted the whistleblowers as disgruntled, incompetent employees with an axe to grind. But the real battle was being fought by the lawyers. David Boies, the legendary litigator who sat on the Theranos board, a conflict of interest that would later stun legal ethicists, unleashed a legal blitzkrieg. His firm, Boies Schiller Flexner, threatened the Wall Street Journal with defamation lawsuits that would bankrupt the paper. They sent cease and desist letters to doctors, former employees, and anyone who had spoken to Carey-Rue. They hired private investigators to stake out the homes of Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, hoping to find dirt to discredit them. It was a campaign of intimidation designed to silence the witnesses before the regulators could arrive. However, the regulators were already at the door. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, alerted by the article and the earlier complaint from Erica Chung, launched a surprise inspection of the Newark, California laboratory in November 2015. This was not a scheduled visit. It was a raid. The inspectors demanded access to the raw data. They demanded to see the validation studies. What they found was a scene of scientific carnage. The inspection report, which would be released in early 2016, was a death warrant for the company. It detailed how the lab failed to meet even the most basic standards of accuracy. It found that the proprietary Edison machines were erratic and unreliable. It found that the company had run thousands of patient tests on machines that were not calibrated. Most damning of all, the CMS declared that the Theranos lab posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. This is the regulatory equivalent of a do not cross line. It meant that the lab was so dangerous that it had to be shut down immediately to prevent people from dying. The release of the CMS letter in January 2016 was the moment the house of cards began to collapse. Walgreens, the retail giant that had staked its reputation on the partnership, realized it had been conned. The executives at Walgreens were furious. They had invested $140 million and built 40 wellness centers based on Elizabeth's promises. Now, they were facing potential liability for every false test result given to a customer. In June 2016, Walgreens formally terminated its relationship with Theranos. They shut down all the testing centers. They filed a lawsuit for breach of contract, demanding their money back. It was a humiliating public divorce. Theranos lost its only source of revenue and its only connection to the real world of patients. But the most dangerous threat was not corporate. It was federal. The Department of Justice, DOJ, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, had opened investigations. The FBI was interviewing investors. The vampire was being hunted. Elizabeth Holmes, however, refused to accept reality. Throughout 2016, she continued to act the part of the visionary CEO. She appeared at conferences, defending her technology. She unveiled a new machine, the Mini Lab, claiming it would solve all the problems. She was still in founder mode, believing that she could pivot her way out of a federal indictment. Her denial was absolute, but the people around her were waking up. The board of directors, the old guard of Kissinger and Schultz, began to realize they had been used as props. They quietly resigned or were replaced. The investors, realizing their money was gone, began to sue. As 2016 ended, Theranos was a zombie company. It had no product, no partners, and no revenue. But Elizabeth Holmes was still standing, a defiant queen in a crumbling castle, convinced that she was just one breakthrough away from redemption. She did not know that the final fatal blow would come not from a courtroom, but from a bookstore. John Carey-Rue was writing a book. The release of John Carey-Rue's book, Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies, in a Silicon Valley startup in May 2018, was the cultural turning point that transformed Elizabeth Holmes from a disgraced CEO into a national villain. The book was a forensic masterwork. It detailed the bullying of employees, the faked demos, the suicide of Ian Gibbons, and the terrifying reality of the falsified patient tests. It stripped away the last vestiges of ambiguity. Elizabeth Holmes was not a misguided visionary who failed. She was a conscious fraudster who had endangered lives. The book became an instant bestseller, fueling a public rage that demanded accountability. This public reckoning coincided with the legal hammer falling. In March 2018, the SEC charged Holmes and Balwani with massive fraud, alleging they had raised more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate, years-long deception. Elizabeth settled the civil charges, agreeing to pay a $500,000 fine and be barred from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. To the public, this seemed like a slap on the wrist, a cost of doing business for the rich. But the Department of Justice was preparing a far more severe punishment. On June 15, 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani on 9 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment was a scorched earth document. It alleged that they had knowingly deceived investors, doctors, and patients. It detailed the specific lies, the claims that the Edison machine could run comprehensive tests, the claims that the technology was being used by the Department of Defense, and the claims of financial health. On the same day the indictment was unsealed, Elizabeth Holmes stepped down as CEO of Theranos. The company, which had once been valued at $9 billion, was now worthless. In September 2018, Theranos formally dissolved. The employees were fired. The remaining cash was distributed to creditors. The unicorn was dead. But Elizabeth Holmes was not in prison. She was free on bail, and she began a bizarre, surreal campaign of personal reinvention. As 2019 dawned, the public expected to see a contrite, broken woman preparing for prison. Instead, they saw a socialite. Elizabeth abandoned the black turtlenecks and the severe, unblinking persona. She began to dress in soft, feminine colors. She wore her hair in loose curls. She was photographed smiling, walking her dog, Balto, a husky she claimed was a wolf, and attending Burning Man. This transformation reached its peak with her marriage to Billy Evans, a wealthy hotel heir, 8 years her junior. The wedding was a secret affair, but the message was public. Elizabeth was moving on. She was building a new life. Legal analysts and psychologists debated the strategy. Was this genuine delusion, or was it a calculated performance designed to sway a future jury? By presenting herself as a young wife, and soon a mother, she gave birth to her first child in July 2021, just months before her trial was set to begin. She was creating a character that was harder to convict. It is difficult to send a new mother to prison. It is difficult to see a smiling, soft-spoken woman as a ruthless fraudster. This period, 2019 to 2020, was also defined by the legal severance of the 2 co-conspirators. Elizabeth's lawyers, a new team from Williams and Connolly, the same firm that had defended the Andreas family in the ADM scandal, filed a motion to sever her trial from Sunny Balwani's. They argued that their defenses were mutually antagonistic. The strategy became clear. Elizabeth was going to throw Sunny under the bus. She was going to argue that she was not the mastermind, but the victim. She was going to claim that Sunny, the older, domineering man, had manipulated and controlled her, that the fraud was his doing, and that she was merely a naive pawn in his game. This was the Svengali defense. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. It required Elizabeth to take the stand and testify about intimate, abusive details of her relationship. It required her to dismantle the Iron Lady persona she had spent a decade building and replace it with the persona of a battered woman. As the trial date approached in 2021, delayed by the COVID-19 pandemic and her pregnancy, the tension in Silicon Valley was electric. The trial of Elizabeth Holmes was not just about one woman. It was a referendum on the entire culture of fake it till you make it. It was the moment when the ethos of disruption would finally be held accountable to the rule of law. On August 31st, 2021, the trial of United States versus Elizabeth A. Holmes finally began in the Robert F. Peckham Federal Building in San Jose, California. It was the most anticipated legal event in the history of Silicon Valley, a spectacle that drew lines of spectators that wrapped around the block at 4 a.m. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Elizabeth Holmes, now a new mother, sat at the defense table maskless, despite COVID protocols, flanked by her high-priced legal team. The black turtleneck persona was gone. She wore soft pastel suits and held hands with her mother, projecting an image of vulnerability that clashed violently with the charges read against her. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Leach, wasted no time in dismantling the visionary myth. In his opening statement, Leach looked at the jury and delivered a line that cut to the heart of the case. Out of time and out of money, Elizabeth Holmes decided to lie. The government's case was built on two pillars: the fraud against investors and the fraud against patients. While the financial fraud involved larger numbers, it was the patient testimony that brought the horror of the Theranos lab into the courtroom. The prosecution brought the laboratory of horrors directly into the courtroom. Witnesses like Brittany Gould and Aaron Tompkins took the stand. They didn't speak of financial ratios or stock prices. They spoke of the terror of false miscarriages and phantom HIV diagnoses. Their testimony stripped away the abstraction of wire fraud and replaced it with the visceral reality of medical malpractice. The jury watched, stone-faced, as the victims described the emotional torture inflicted by Holmes's glitchy machines. These witnesses were critical. They proved that Elizabeth Holmes's white lies about technology had real-world consequences. They stripped away the abstraction of wire fraud and replaced it with the visceral reality of medical malpractice. Then came the patriarchs, the powerful men who had been seduced by Holmes. The prosecution called General James Mattis to the stand. The former Secretary of Defense, a man known as Mad Dog, looked diminished on the witness stand. He admitted that he had been charmed by Holmes. He admitted that he had put his own reputation on the line for her, intervening with regulators on her behalf without ever seeing a single piece of verified data. It was a humiliation for the American establishment, proving that even the most disciplined leaders could be blinded by a compelling narrative. The testimony of the investors was equally damning. A representative for the DeVos family, who invested $100 million, testified that they had done almost no due diligence. They hadn't looked at the financials. They hadn't consulted scientists. They had invested because everyone else was doing it and because they trusted the board members like Henry Kissinger. It was a portrait of elite negligence, a clubby world where billions were exchanged on a handshake and a smile. But the most damaging witness was not a victim or an investor. It was a subordinate. Sureka Gengakedkar, a former manager of assay systems at Theranos, testified about the day she quit. She described how she printed out the incriminatory emails and the failed data, took them home, and then resigned because she was terrified of being blamed for killing someone. She described the pressure from Sunny Balwani to validate tests that didn't work. As the prosecution rested its case in November 2021, the weight of the evidence was crushing. The government had presented 29 witnesses who painted a consistent picture of a CEO who knew exactly what was happening. They showed the emails where Holmes discussed the lack of revenue. They showed the forged logos of pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer and Schering-Plough, that Holmes had personally photoshopped onto Theranos reports to make them look official. The vampire had been exposed in the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom, but Elizabeth Holmes had one final desperate card to play. In a move that shocked the legal world, her lawyers announced that the defendant would take the stand. Elizabeth Holmes was going to testify. When Elizabeth Holmes walked to the witness stand on November 19, 2021, the courtroom fell into a stunned silence. In white-collar criminal trials, it is extraordinarily rare for the defendant to testify. The risk of cross-examination is simply too high. But Holmes had built her entire career on her ability to persuade, and she was betting her life that she could charm the jury just as she had charmed Henry Kissinger. Her testimony lasted for 7 grueling days. Under direct examination from her own lawyer, she was soft-spoken, emotional, and contrite. She admitted mistakes. She admitted adding the Pfizer logos to the reports was an error in judgment. But she framed these as the errors of a young, inexperienced visionary, not a criminal. Then she pivoted to the Svengali defense. In a voice shaking with emotion, she described her relationship with Sunny Balwani. She told the jury that he had controlled every aspect of her life: what she ate, when she slept, how she dressed. She read from handwritten notes Balwani had given her. "I have molded you." She accused him of sexual and emotional abuse. She claimed that his influence had clouded her judgment, that she deferred to him on all operational matters in the lab because she was terrified of him. It was a powerful, disturbing narrative. It recast the Iron Lady CEO as a victim of coercive control. But then came the cross-examination. Prosecutor Robert Leach stood up. He was not charmed. He was methodical. He didn't ask about her relationship. He asked about the business. He showed her the emails where she gave the orders. He showed her the text messages where she bragged about crushing the competition. He asked her why, if Balwani was in control, she was the one on the cover of Fortune magazine calling herself the inventor. "Who was the CEO?" Leach asked. "I was," Holmes replied. "Who owned the controlling shares?" "I did." "Who had the power to fire Sunny Balwani?" Holmes paused. "I did." With each question, the victim narrative began to fray. Leach forced her to admit, point by point, that she had lied to investors. She admitted she told them the devices were used by the military when they weren't. She admitted she told them the company was profitable when it was losing millions. The most devastating moment came when Leach played an audio recording of a call Holmes had with investors in 2013. In the recording, her voice was deep, confident, and authoritative. She was boasting about the technology's capabilities, making claims she knew were false. The jury heard the voice of the con artist, not the victim. As the trial concluded in December 2021, the jury was left with 2 competing portraits. Was Elizabeth Holmes a battered woman who had lost control of her company? Or was she a ruthless sociopath who used her boyfriend as a henchman to execute her fraud? On January 3, 2022, after 7 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty. Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of defrauding investors. The jury acquitted her on the patient fraud counts, a legal nuance that likely reflected the difficulty of proving she intended to hurt specific patients, though the moral stain remained. As the verdict was read, Holmes sat stoically. She hugged her family. She walked out of the courthouse holding hands with her husband, Billy Evans. She remained free on bail pending sentencing, but the reality was inescapable. The next Steve Jobs was now a convicted felon. 6 months later, in July 2022, the second act of the legal drama played out. Sunny Balwani faced his own trial. Without Elizabeth there to blame him, his defense collapsed. He was convicted on all 12 counts of fraud, both investor and patient fraud. The jury found that he too was a willing architect of the scheme. The drop of blood had finally been analyzed by the justice system, and the result was conclusive. The technology was fake, the money was stolen, and the leaders of Theranos were criminals. In November 2022, Elizabeth Holmes returned to court for sentencing. Judge Edward Davila looked at the woman who had once promised to save the world and delivered the final judgment. He sentenced her to 11 years and 3 months, 135 months, in federal prison. It was a sentence that signaled the end of an era in Silicon Valley. It was a warning that the fake it till you make it culture had a limit, and that limit was fraud. Elizabeth Holmes, the fallen aristocrat who had tried to redeem her family's name with lies, had instead destroyed it completely. She was no longer a billionaire. She was inmate number 24,965-111. As the gavel fell on the sentencing of Elizabeth Holmes in November 2022, the reverberations were felt far beyond the courtroom in San Jose. The 135-month sentence was a definitive punctuation mark on a saga that had captivated and horrified the world for nearly a decade. But the legal process had one final agonizing chapter left to play out: the fate of the victims. While the investors like Rupert Murdoch and the Walton family could write off their losses as bad bets, the patients who had been traumatized by false diagnoses were left with a more complicated form of justice. In the months following the verdict, the court wrestled with the issue of restitution. The government argued that Holmes should be forced to pay back the nearly $1 billion she had defrauded. Holmes's lawyers argued that she was bankrupt, that she had zero assets left after years of legal fees. The court ultimately ordered her and Balwani to pay $452 million in restitution to the victims. But everyone in the courtroom knew it was a symbolic number. The money was gone, burned up in the furnace of Theranos' operating costs and legal defense. The end of 2022 marked the total collapse of the Holmes family's dynastic ambition. Christian Holmes IV, the father who had pushed Elizabeth to restore the family's glory, watched his daughter be branded a felon. In the courtroom, looking at her father, Christian Holmes IV, one could see the tragic completion of the cycle. The daughter had tried to outrun the father's failures at Enron, only to build a fraud that was even more personal and devastating. The shame was absolute. The family that had once been associated with the Fleischmann fortune and the heights of Washington, D.C. society was now synonymous with one of the largest corporate frauds in American history. For Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, the verdict was a vindication, but it came at a steep personal price. Tyler had spent years estranged from his grandfather, George Schultz. The former Secretary of State, a man of immense pride, had refused to admit he was wrong until the very end. He died in February 2021, just months before the trial began. According to Tyler, his grandfather never apologized. He went to his grave believing, or pretending to believe, that he had backed a genius. It was a final bitter tragedy of the Holmes curse. It destroyed not just the Holmes family, but the families of those who got too close. As Elizabeth Holmes prepared to report to prison in early 2023, she made a final frantic attempt to delay her surrender. Her lawyers filed appeal after appeal, arguing that she should be allowed to stay free while her conviction was reviewed. She cited her 2 young children, the second born just after her sentencing, as reasons for leniency. But the courts were unmoved. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals denied her request. On May 30th, 2023, the final scene of the drama played out. Elizabeth Holmes, the woman who had once graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes, the woman who had promised to change the world, reported to the federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas. She was no longer a CEO. She was no longer a visionary. She was inmate 24,965-111, a resident of a minimum security facility where she would spend the next decade of her life scrubbing floors and earning 12 cents an hour. The drop of blood had finally dried up. The trial of the century had exposed the rot at the heart of the unicorn economy. It proved that the fake it till you make it ethos had a body count. And it left behind a warning to the next generation of founders. You can disrupt an industry, you can disrupt a market, but you cannot disrupt the truth. The final image of the Theranos story is not the magazine covers or the billions of dollars. It is the image of a single tiny drop of blood. Elizabeth Holmes believed she could squeeze immortality out of it. Instead, she treated blood not as the sacred fluid of life, but as currency to be diluted, hacked, and sold. In the end, the vampire of Silicon Valley discovered the one scientific truth she could not escape. You cannot build a life on a foundation of fake tears and stolen blood. The lab is closed, the machines are scrap metal, and the prophecy is fulfilled. The dynasty is dead, killed by its own ambition.